The first time anyone saw the tent, they laughed. Not a polite chuckle behind a gloved hand, not an awkward smile quickly hidden. A full, open-air laugh, the kind that carries across a campsite and bounces off frozen pines and makes the person on the receiving end feel every inch of the distance between what they built and what everyone else expected. Elias Voss had arrived at the trailhead in late October of 1922, carrying more than anyone thought one man could haul on a single pack frame. He was 31 years old, medium height, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet that people mistake for stupidity, right up until the moment they realize it's actually patience. He'd driven up from a small town in western Montana, loaded his truck the night before in a light sleet, and arrived at the base camp staging area for what would become a 7-day hunting and trapping expedition into the Whitefish Range. The other men had already made camp by the time he pulled in. There were 6 of them, all experienced, all local, men who had been running these mountains since they were old enough to carry a rifle. They'd set up their canvas wall tents in the standard way, the way everyone set up wall tents in 1922, the way their fathers had taught them and their fathers before that. 4 walls, a ridgepole overhead, a stove in the middle. Done. Simple, functional, proven. Elias set up something entirely different. He worked for almost 3 hours while the others finished their supper and watched from the fire circle. He dug down first, which was the thing that started the laughing. He pulled a small folding spade from his pack and began cutting into the earth, carving out a shallow depression roughly the size of the tent floor. The ground wasn't frozen yet, not hard frozen, and he made good progress. About 14 inches down, he stopped, smoothed the floor flat, and began assembling the tent frame above that excavated base. But that wasn't all. Along the outside of where the tent walls would hang, he built up low walls of packed snow and forest debris, a combination of branches, pine duff, dead leaves, and compacted snow that he tamped down firmly with his boots. He angled these berm walls outward slightly at the base so they'd shed meltwater. He ran a thin trench around the outside perimeter of the whole structure, barely a hand's width wide, just enough to carry any water that might work its way toward the tent floor. Then he strung a secondary layer of canvas over the main tent roof, leaving a gap of several inches between the 2 layers, lashing it to the same frame with a slightly different pitch so the 2 surfaces never touched. The whole thing took until almost 9 at night. By the time he drove the last stake, the fire had burned low and most of the other men had turned in. But one of them, a trapper named Cecil Hobart who ran lines up in the Stillwater drainage every winter and had opinions about everything related to cold weather living, stood at the edge of the firelight with a tin cup of coffee and watched Elias finish. "That is the strangest tent I have ever seen a man build," Cecil said. Elias didn't look up. He was staking the last guy line, pulling it tight against the weight of the berm he'd built along the windward side. "It'll do what I need it to do," he said. Cecil looked at the berms, at the double roof, at the sunken floor. "All that work for a tent you're sleeping in 1 week." Elias finally looked up. "More work now means less suffering later," he said. "That's a trade I'm always willing to make." Cecil walked back to the fire. The next morning at breakfast, he told the others what he'd seen, and that's when the laughing really started. Not mean-spirited, the way men sometimes are when they feel threatened. Just the easy dismissal of a group who'd never had reason to question what they already knew. "Old Elias dug himself a foxhole," one of the younger men said. "What are you afraid of? A ground squirrel coming up through the floor?" Elias ate his eggs and said nothing. To understand why Elias built the way he built, you have to understand where he came from. Not the town in Montana, though that matters. You have to understand the education he'd received, an education that had nothing to do with any school. His father, August Voss, had come to Montana from Minnesota in 1898 with a family, almost no money, and a habit of reading everything he could find. Accounts from Arctic explorers, letters from hunters who'd spent months in the Canadian wilderness, a German text on military field fortification reprinted with notes on cold weather applications. From all of it, August had distilled something simple. Cold air is the enemy you can fight directly, but the ground is the enemy most people forget about. Go down a foot or two and the temperature stabilizes. It doesn't spike with the wind, it holds any structure that isolates itself from surface conditions and connects itself to that stable underground temperature, performs differently than one that just sits on top of the frozen world like a box on a skating rink. August had built their homestead cabin with a packed earth floor and bermed exterior walls on the north and west sides, explaining every choice to his children while he worked. Elias had been 6 years old when the cabin went up. By the time he was 12, he understood the principles so thoroughly he could explain them himself. The double roof was something he'd developed on his own in his late teens, after spending a particularly miserable night in a standard canvas tent during an early November storm. He'd been cold, not dangerously cold, but the cold that won't let you sleep, the cold that keeps pulling heat out of you no matter how many blankets you pile on. In the morning, he'd sat up and thought about what had failed, and what he'd realized was simple. The canvas wall right next to his head was almost touching the outside air. There was nothing between him and the weather but a single thin layer of fabric. No dead airspace, no insulation, nothing. Dead airspace. That was the key. Still air, trapped between two surfaces, is one of the best insulators a person can create without any manufactured materials at all. It's free. It weighs nothing. It just requires the thought to build it in. After that, he always doubled his tent roof when conditions required it. Sometimes he got looks. He was used to it by the time he arrived in the Whitefish Range in 1922. The first 3 days of the trip passed without incident. Temperatures stayed in the low 20s at night, manageable by any experienced outdoorsman's standards. The men were working hard in the day, covering ground, setting lines, pushing deep into the drainage. At night, they gathered around the fire before turning in, telling stories, drinking coffee, talking about game sign and trail conditions, the way hunters have done for as long as there have been men and fires. Elias participated in these evenings, but he was quieter than the rest. He listened more than he talked. He noted things without announcing that he was noting them. On the second night, he watched Cecil Hobart spend almost 10 minutes trying to get his stove to draw properly, fighting a backdraft that kept pushing cold air down the flue and cooling the tent instead of heating it. He said nothing, but he thought about it. On the third night, the temperature dropped sharply. It had been coming. The sky had that flat look all day, the kind of white that isn't clouds exactly, but a density in the air above the clouds, a layering that blocks the kind of light that would otherwise give the sky depth. The old-timers called it a milk sky, and they didn't like it. Elias had watched it all afternoon while he was working his way back to camp, and he'd added wood to his stove earlier than usual, getting the interior of his sunken tent warm before the cold really arrived. By midnight, the temperature was somewhere below zero. By 2 in the morning, it had dropped further. How far? Nobody could say exactly, because the only thermometer in camp belonged to a man named Frank Aldis, who kept it inside his tent and only checked it in the morning. But when Frank checked it at first light on day 4, it read 17 below zero. In Elias's tent, the temperature had dropped to right around 35 degrees during the coldest part of the night. Cold enough that you wouldn't want to sleep without blankets, but not cold that threatens life, not cold that makes you consider whether you're going to make it to morning. In the standard wall tents, the story was different. Cecil Hobart would admit later, with the grudging honesty of a man who knows he has no choice but to be truthful, that his tent had dropped to somewhere around -5 or -8 degrees during the night. He'd woken up around 3 in the morning to find his water bucket frozen solid through the middle. The fire in his stove had burned low while he slept, and the cold had come in through the canvas like it was gauze, like there was nothing there at all, and his breath had fogged so thickly in the lamplight that for a moment he'd thought the tent was full of smoke. He'd gotten his stove going again, burned through nearly twice his expected wood supply for the night, and had still spent the rest of the morning in a kind of deep chill that sits in your bones and takes hours to leave, even after the air around you warms. 2 of the other men had nearly identical experiences. The youngest member of the group, a 23-year-old named Tom Richart, who was on his first serious winter expedition, had done something that could have killed him. He'd gone outside to add wood to a small external cache he'd left near his tent door, wearing only his long underwear and wool socks, and had spent 6 or 7 minutes in the -17-degree air. By the time he got back inside, his toes were white. It took an hour of careful warming before feeling returned properly, and even then 2 of them stayed numb until almost noon. Elias had slept the entire night. That morning at breakfast, the mood had changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everyone stopped and formally acknowledged what had happened. It was subtler than that, the way moods shift in small groups when reality has quietly settled a question that words had been bouncing back and forth around. Cecil came over to Elias's tent before the food was ready, stood outside the low entrance and looked at the bermed walls, at the double roof. at the depression in the ground where the tent sat like it had grown there rather than been assembled. He looked for a long time without saying anything. "How warm did you stay?" he finally asked. Elias was inside, visible through the open tent flap, pouring water into a pot from a container that had not frozen. "Around freezing point, maybe a little above," he said. "Used about the same wood as usual." Cecil was quiet. Then, "How'd you know to build it that way?" Elias thought about his father, about the homestead cabin and the packed earth floor and the long conversations while they worked, about the German text on field fortification that he'd read at 16 until the binding cracked. "My father understood cold," he said. "He taught me that the ground knows something the air doesn't. You just have to listen to it." Cecil nodded slowly. "That's a lot of work to put in at the end of a long drive. Less work than spending the night with your water frozen and your wood supply gone." Elias handed Cecil a cup of coffee. He'd kept the water warm all night. Cecil took it. Neither man said anything more, but the conversation was finished in a way that mattered. "And I want to stop right here for a moment and ask you something, because I think about this part of the story a lot. When you are facing a problem that everyone around you treats as normal and unavoidable, just the way things are, do you accept it as given, or do you go looking for the solution that people stopped looking for before they found it? I'd genuinely love to know what you would have done in that situation. Leave it in the comments, because the answers might surprise you more than you'd expect. What Elias had built was not, by any definition, complicated. It required no manufactured materials beyond what any camper would already have. No specialized equipment, no technology that didn't exist 1,000 years ago. It required only observation, thought, and a willingness to spend 3 hours doing something that looked strange to the people watching. The principles were ancient. Indigenous peoples across Arctic and subarctic regions had known for thousands of years that semi-subterranean structures are warmer, more stable, and more survivable than surface structures. The snow house built across the Arctic is one of the most thermally efficient shelters ever devised, and it works almost entirely by trapping still air and leveraging the insulating mass packed around it. What Elias had done was apply those same principles to portable canvas shelter. The sunken floor put the sleeping space below the surface air layer, which dropped several degrees during a clear, cold night because of radiative cooling, the process by which the ground surface loses heat rapidly to the clear sky. If you're sleeping on that surface, you're sleeping at the coldest point in the local environment. If you're sleeping 14 inches below it, you're in ground that doesn't participate in that rapid surface cooling. The bermed walls blocked the wind from finding the gap between the tent base and the ground, that thin crack where cold air slides under canvas and claims the floor. The massive packed material also insulated the lower third of the tent wall, where the coldest air pools. Inside any structure, the double roof was the simplest principle. Heat rises, and the tent roof is where it escapes. 2 layers of canvas with trapped still air between them cut that heat loss dramatically. The 2 surfaces never touch, so no conduction happens between them. All of this Elias understood not as theory but as lived knowledge, the kind of understanding that has been tested by consequences and refined until it isn't information anymore but instinct. The storm came on the 5th day. It had been building the whole time, patient the way weather in the northern Rockies is patient, giving you just enough clear days to get deep enough into the backcountry that retreating becomes complicated. The morning of day 5 started cold and still, colder than anything that had come before. The trees stood without movement. The snow surface had that dense, settled quality that happens when cold is not just present but established, as if it has taken up residence and is not planning to leave. By mid-morning, the wind arrived, not gradually, not the slow escalation that gives you time to think about your options. It arrived the way serious mountain weather often arrives, all at once, a shift so complete that within 20 minutes the world had transformed from still to violent. The temperature dropped as the wind came in, dropping fast in the way that happens when a true Arctic air mass pushes south out of Canada and doesn't wait for anything. The men were scattered across the drainage when it hit. 2 of them were close enough to camp to make it back without serious trouble. 3 others, including Elias, were farther out and had to work hard through rising wind and snow to get back before visibility went entirely. Tom Richart, the youngest, had been the farthest out and had the most frightening walk of his life getting back to camp, following the line he'd strung between trail markers, using it like a rope in a dark room, hand over hand back toward a camp he couldn't see. They all made it. But by the time the last man was back in camp, the storm had taken over completely. The wind was gusting to what felt like 50 or 60 miles per hour. The temperature, which had already been somewhere around 10 below zero when the wind arrived, was pushing into territory that the human body cannot occupy unprotected. The snow came horizontally, not falling but being driven, not precipitation, but assault. Within an hour, drifts had formed against every windward surface in camp. Against the windward side of Elias's tent, the berm he'd built had compressed under the weight of the new snow and become something almost structural, a wedge of packed material that actually deflected the worst of the wind over and around the tent, rather than allowing it to press directly against the canvas. The tent didn't flex and shudder the way the others did. It sat low and solid and absorbed the storm without drama. Inside the wall tents, the situation was different. The wind found the base gap and pried it open whenever a gust hit from the right angle. It found the single-layer roof and pressed through it with the cold, the way cold presses through anything that isn't thick enough to stop it. Stoves burned harder, wood disappeared faster. The men fed their fires and watched their wood supplies go down and thought about how many more hours the storm was going to last. It lasted through the night and into the following day. Nearly 30 hours of sustained Arctic conditions, with temperatures that never rose above 22 below zero during the storm's peak. The kind of cold that changes your relationship to everything you thought you understood about comfort and survival. Elias burned about the same amount of wood he burned on any other night. His tent interior stayed between 30 and 38 degrees throughout the worst of it. Not warm, not the kind of warmth you'd choose if you were home in a house with a furnace, but alive warm. The kind of warmth that means your body isn't burning itself up trying to maintain core temperature. The kind that lets you sleep, cook, think, function. In the other tents, 2 of the men burned through their entire remaining wood supply during those 30 hours. One of them, Frank Aldous, who'd had the thermometer, burned not just his remaining wood but a pair of extra tent stakes and the handle of a spare axe he'd had in his pack. He sat through the worst hours of the night feeding his stove with anything dry enough to burn and watching his exhaled breath fog and dissipate and fog again, telling himself with each hour that the storm had to be peaking, that it had to start letting up soon. It didn't let up until almost noon the next day. When the wind finally died and the snow settled and the world went quiet again, the men came out of their shelters into a landscape that looked like another world. Drifts had remade everything. Familiar landmarks were gone or altered beyond quick recognition. The camp itself had been reduced to mounds and shapes under white. Elias emerged first, moving through the snow without the stiffness that was visible in the other men as they came out one by one over the next half hour. He'd slept, not perfectly, but enough. He'd eaten properly the night before because his water supply hadn't frozen and his stove had maintained a temperature that allowed real cooking. He was cold, the way anyone is cold after 30 hours in a winter storm, but it was surface cold, the kind that a hot cup of coffee pushes back quickly. The others carried a deeper cold. Tom Richard had not slept for the last 14 hours of the storm. He'd been kept awake by the cold inside his tent, a numbing, persistent cold that his stove hadn't been able to fully counter, partly because of the design of the tent, and partly because he'd been rationing wood since he realized how fast it was going. He sat down next to the fire Elias had already started before the others were out of their tents, and he held his hands over it, and he didn't say anything for almost 10 minutes. Cecil Hobart came out carrying his thermometer. He'd kept it inside his tent the whole time, as he always did, and now he held it up to read it in the gray morning light. His tent, at its coldest point during the storm, had dropped to -11. Not the temperature outside, the temperature inside his sheltered, stove-heated wall tent. -11. He looked at Elias. "What was it inside yours?" he asked. Elias was stirring the fire. "Around 35 at its coldest," he said. "Maybe a little lower at the very worst of it, but not much." Cecil stood there for a moment. The number he'd just heard represented a difference of roughly 45 to 50 degrees between the 2 tents. Same campsite, same storm, same air temperature outside, roughly the same stove. 50 degrees of difference produced by an excavated floor, bermed walls, and a double roof, made of the same canvas every man in camp was already carrying. "If I hadn't made it back to camp," Cecil said finally, "and had to shelter in the open last night, I'd have died." Elias looked up at him. "Yes, you would have. And you could have built what you built anywhere." "Yes." Cecil sat down next to the fire. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers the way men do when they need to do something with their hands while they're thinking hard about something. They sat in silence for a while, just the two of them, the fire between them, the white world around them, the sound of the other men moving slowly through deep snow back in the direction of the tents. "You should have said something," Cecil said, "before the storm, about how to build it better." Elias thought about that. "I've been saying it," he said, "by building it the way I build it. Every time I've gone out with a group, every single trip." Cecil nodded slowly. "We just weren't paying attention." "No," Elias said. "You weren't." There was no hardness in it, just accuracy. The kind of honest accounting that men in serious situations offer each other when the time for diplomacy has passed. And if you have ever felt like you were doing the right thing, building something correctly, preparing carefully, and nobody around you could see it until something forced them to look, I think you understand something about that moment around that fire. And if that feeling is familiar to you in any part of your life right now, I just want to say, you are not alone in that. People who find real solutions are often invisible until the storm comes. If you want to stay connected to stories like this one, about people who prepared when others laughed and survived when others didn't, consider subscribing. This community is built for exactly that kind of person. The rest of the expedition was different, not dramatically different in its surface details. The men still hunted, they still set lines, still gathered around the fire. At night, still talked about game sign and weather, and the thousand small practical matters of life in the backcountry. But the shape of the group had shifted in the way groups shift after a shared difficulty forces a reordering of what people know about each other. On the last full day in the field, Cecil came to Elias before supper and asked him to walk through the design one more time, slowly, explaining each element and the reason behind it. Elias did, and this time Cecil listened with the focused attention of a man who understands that what he's hearing is the difference between what happened 2 nights ago and what could have happened instead. "The floor," Elias said, standing outside the tent and pointing down at the depression. "The surface loses heat to the clear sky faster than the earth 2 feet down. You put your sleeping space on the surface, you sleep at the coldest point. You drop it 1.5 feet, you're sleeping in stable ground temperature. That's free heat that costs you nothing but the effort of digging." Cecil nodded, writing nothing down but filing everything. "The berms. They're a windbreak first and an insulator second. Wind finds the base of a tent and enters there because that's the line of least resistance. You block that line, you keep warm air in and cold air out. The material doesn't matter much as long as it has mass and you pack it tight. Snow, soil, forest floor material, all of it works. The double roof." Cecil pointed at it. "That's the dead air." "Exactly. Still air doesn't conduct heat the way moving air does. You trap a layer of it between 2 surfaces and it acts like insulation. No manufactured product needed. No cost. Just thought." Cecil looked at the tent for a long time. Then, "My grandfather built his homestead cabin with a turf roof," he said. 2 feet of packed earth over the boards. He always said it was the warmest house he ever lived in." Elias nodded. He understood the same thing your grandfather understood. Mass absorbs and holds temperature. It buffers the swings. A canvas tent can't do what packed earth does, but you can come closer to that principle than most people bother to. Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why don't you write this down? All of this. Set it out in a guide somewhere, in one of the sporting magazines." Elias smiled slightly. "I did once. Sent a letter to a hunting publication in 1917. They published the short version and took out everything that explained why the design worked. Just described what it looked like from the outside. Said the reasoning was too complicated for their readership." Cecil snorted. "So instead of the principles, people just got a description of a strange tent." Elias shrugged. "That's why I build it every time. So people can watch it work. That, in the end, is what the trip meant. Not the game they took, not the miles they covered. What it meant was that 6 men went into the Whitefish Range with one idea about how to shelter in winter conditions and came out with a different one. What it meant was that Cecil Hobart, who had 30 years of winter experience and strong opinions about everything related to cold weather, sat down and rebuilt his understanding from the foundation because the evidence he'd seen with his own eyes was too clear to ignore. By the following autumn, he'd adapted the design for his trapping camp. Not a copy of what Elias had built, but an adaptation, fitted to his specific site and his regular equipment. The sunken floor, shallower than Elias's because the ground where he camped was different but still depressed. The bermed walls on the north and west sides. The double roof with its trapped airspace. He never had another night like the one in the Whitefish Range. There's a larger truth in Elias Voss's tent that goes beyond canvas and snow and trapped air. The knowledge he was working from didn't come from a university or a manufacturer's guide or any institution. It came from a father who had read carefully and built thoughtfully and then talked to his son while he worked. It came from a 16-year-old reading a translated military text until the binding cracked. It came from one bad night in a standard canvas tent that sent Elias into a morning of thinking about what had gone wrong and what could be done differently. That's a specific kind of education. The education of observation combined with consequence. Understanding that comes not from being told, but from watching and thinking and testing. His father had it. The builders of Norse longhouses had it. The people who designed snow shelters across the Arctic had it. It is some of the oldest and most durable knowledge humans have ever produced, and it lives not in books but in practice, passed from person to person, demonstrated rather than explained. What makes it fragile is exactly what makes all such knowledge fragile. It requires someone willing to look strange, someone willing to spend 3 hours at the end of a long drive building something that makes experienced men laugh at the campfire. It requires patience with the long game. Most people don't have that patience. Faced with the laughter of their peers, they make adjustments. They don't dig down as far. They skip the double roof because it looks excessive. Each compromise seems small. Together they produce a tent that works about as well as everyone else's, which is to say, well enough in mild conditions and dangerously poorly in the conditions that actually test you. Elias never made those compromises. Not because he was stubborn, but because he had felt in his body what the cost was. You don't forget what you've felt in your body the way you forget what you've read. There's a further detail to this story that I've been saving because it's the kind of detail that reveals something about a person's character more clearly than anything else can. When the group got back to the trailhead after the 7 days, loading up their trucks in the cold afternoon light, Tom Richart, the youngest, came to Elias before they parted. He was 23, and 2 nights ago he'd had white toes in the middle of the night from a brief trip outside in his long underwear. He'd spent 30 hours in a tent that dropped 11 below zero while the man in the tent 30 feet away stayed 35 degrees above. He stood in front of Elias with the directness of young men who haven't yet learned to dress things up. "Can you teach me to build what you built?" he said. Not a question exactly, a statement with a question mark behind it. Elias looked at him for a moment. Not measuring him, exactly, but seeing him, the same way his father had seen him at 6 years old on a homestead building site, a small person paying full attention, ready to learn. "Come find me this spring," Elias said. "We'll take a week and I'll show you everything I know." Tom drove home. He did come back that spring. He spent 5 days with Elias, learning not just the tent design but the broader thinking behind it. How to read a site before you build on it. How to identify the thermal landscape of a campsite, the cold pockets and warm ones, the wind corridors and natural wind breaks. How to think about a structure as a system rather than a collection of parts. He spent the next 40 years running hunting and trapping expeditions in Montana, Wyoming, and British Columbia. In that time, he never lost anyone to cold exposure, not once. He taught the design to dozens of guides and outfitters, always explaining the reasoning behind each element the way Elias had explained it to him, because he understood that the explanation was not separate from the technique. It was the more important part. The technique can be copied imperfectly and still get you most of the way there, but the understanding allows you to adapt, to improvise, to solve the problem of the specific site in the specific storm. The understanding doesn't depend on having the right equipment. It works with whatever you have because it is based in principles that don't change. Elias Voss never became famous. His name doesn't appear in any wilderness survival literature. He was not a guide with a reputation to advertise. He was just a man from a small town in western Montana who had learned from his father and kept building the same careful tent, trip after trip, year after year, long past the point where anyone was laughing. He died in 1956 at 65 years old. His obituary mentioned that he was an avid outdoorsman. It did not mention the tent design. It did not mention the 17 below zero night in the Whitefish Range or Cecil Hobart's thermometer reading -11 inside a heated tent while Elias's tent held 35. Those details lived somewhere else. They lived in Tom Richart's memory, and in the memories of the outfitters Tom had trained, and in the quiet competence of men who had gone into northern winters and come home every time. Knowledge like that rarely gets monuments. It survives through use, through demonstration, through one person watching another do something right and deciding to learn why it works instead of just how it looks, which is exactly the only way it was ever going to survive. Because that's the thing about cold, about winter, about any force of nature that doesn't care about human dignity or reputation or the laughter at a campfire. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't offer exceptions for the experienced or the confident or the well-equipped. It arrives and it tests what you built. And in that testing, the truth of what you know versus what you only think you know becomes unavoidably clear. The man who builds the strange tent and stays warm through the night carries something that cannot be argued with. Not expertise exactly, not credentials, just a fire that starts on the first match when other people's wood is frozen, and a temperature inside his shelter that is livable when other people's shelters are not. That is the only argument that ends the conversation. The blizzard makes it every time, in every era, for every person who chose preparation over the comfort of fitting in. The mockery in September is easy. Dry kindling in January is hard. Elias Voss understood that in his bones, the way you understand things you've learned from consequence rather than instruction. And he went on understanding it, quietly and without ceremony, for 35 years of winters in the northern Rockies, until his last fall expedition, which he completed without incident at the age of 64, 1 year before he died. That's the whole story, or most of it. The rest of it is still being written by anyone who chooses to observe carefully, think slowly, and build right even when people are watching and laughing and calling it a foxhole. If you stayed with this story through to the end, I want to say something simple. Thank you, not the automatic kind of thanks that gets written into scripts, but a real one. Stories like Elias Voss's take time to find and time to tell properly, and the only reason it's worth finding them and telling them is because people like you are willing to sit with them and let them settle in. There is something in the way Elias worked, quiet, patient, willing to look strange, building for function rather than appearance, that I think speaks to something most of us recognize even if we don't always live it. The preparation that no one sees until the moment it matters. The knowledge that doesn't announce itself but reveals itself when the temperature drops and the wind arrives. If this story found you at the right moment, or if it gave you something to think about, consider sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you want to stay with this community, there is another story waiting right now that I think you will find just as hard to put down. The kind of story where someone everyone underestimated turned out to be the only one who had gotten it right. It is there whenever you are ready for it. Stay warm, build well.